I'm going to get into my presentation. Now, the majority of Muslims are nonviolent, but there's a minority of Muslims that do commit terrorist attacks, like the Orlando killer recently, and Paris attacks, and San Bernardino attacks, and Boston bombings, and Fort Hood shootings, and beheadings in Oklahoma, and entire Nigerian Christian villages being wiped out and burned to death, and Kenya mall killings, and acid attacks in Pakistan where they throw acid in a girl's face if she's not wearing the burqa, and Christian churches that have existed from the Apostles' Day being destroyed under our watch, Iraq's oldest monastery destroyed, and then we see the grave of Jonah. It existed from 700 BC up until last year when ISIS Muslims destroyed it. And now politicians are quick to assure us that these Muslims doing these terrorist attacks do not represent true Islam. Yet, in many cases, the terrorists themselves are yelling Allahu Akbar, and they claim they do represent true Islam. Who can tell us what true Islam is? One person, Muhammad. So, Muhammad was the best Muslim that ever lived. His life is called the Sunnah, which means the way or the example. And his life went through 3 stages, and we need to understand these 3 stages so that we can see, are we being set up for an Arab Spring here in America? The first stage is Muhammad was a religious leader, then he became a political leader, then he became a military leader. And so this is the world 20 years before Muhammad was born. It's the Byzantine Christian Empire. Remember, Romans persecuted Christians for 3 centuries, and then Constantine converted, and the Roman Empire became Christian. And so it was Christian for several centuries until the Muslims invaded. And so this is the world when Muhammad's 40 years old, and see how it's encroaching on the Byzantine Empire. So these were the 2 superpowers. They beat each other up and left a power vacuum that into came Islam. So Muhammad starts his faith. He's very excited, feels like there's something in it for everyone, and anticipates everybody's going to join. It's going to be the religion for the world. Well, he only makes 70 converts in 12 years. And no one's really excited about it. And so then he gets frustrated and confrontational, and he hangs around that square building, that Kaaba in Mecca, and he begins to insult the pagans and tell them that they're going to burn in hell, and their ancestors are screaming in hell. And these pagans are like, look, we're really tolerant. We're letting you do your new faith, but you're getting too exclusive. And when Muhammad's rich uncle dies, the people of Mecca decide to chase Muhammad out of town. He tries to go to a city called Al-Taif. They don't want him. They pelt him with rocks and stones. He has nowhere to go. He is a Muslim refugee. He goes north 210 miles to a Jewish city. And the Jews are nice. They let him in as a Muslim immigrant. Muhammad goes into the minority neighborhoods in Medina and begins to organize a following. We're familiar with the term of organizing in the community. He goes amongst the pagans who have no voice in the Jewish government, and they have grievances, and he organizes them. Then he goes to the Jews and pressures the Jews to accommodate him and his followers politically. Now Muhammad's followers in Mecca, they get confrontational and threatened and argumentative, and they get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. They're Muslim refugees. They go to Medina. The Jews are nice and let them in as Muslim immigrants. And Muhammad allows his followers to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town. So where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, Muhammad's attitude was, if they take your house, you retaliate, take their caravan. And so he got a whole chapter of the Quran on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. It's Surah 8, chapter 8. He gets 1/5 of the booty, right? So Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt. He's like, no, you retaliate. And so Muhammad has 300 warriors, and they rob caravans. And so in 624 AD, the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to protect and escort their caravan. Muhammad, with 300 warriors, defeats 1,000 at the Battle of Badra. This amazing victory, having been outnumbered 3-1, convinces Muhammad to be a military leader. And he fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies, kills 3,000 people. And so we see that since Muhammad transitions from a religious leader to a political leader to a military leader, Islam is a religious system, a political system, and a military system. A mosque is a religious building, a political building, and a military building. Bowing to Mecca is a religious bowing, a political bowing, and a military pledging of allegiance to another capital. And our effort in the West to split the religious side of Islam away from the political military side is we're trying to split Muhammad. Who are we to split their prophet? He was all 3, a religious leader, a political leader, and a military leader. And so Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, Muhammad put into the Quran not religious doctrines only, but political maxims, criminal and civil laws with punishments. So he's acknowledging it's not just a religion. And so there's two sets of verses in the Quran based on the two cities Muhammad lived in. In Mecca, he was a religious leader, so the verses he gets are just religious and relatively more peaceful. In Medina, the verses he gets are political, military, and violent, and the later verses supersede the earlier verses. By way of comparison, in the Bible, we have an Old Testament and a New Testament. Old Testament has some violence in it, Moses and Joshua wiping out tribes. The New Testament, Jesus and the apostles never killed anyone. And so what do Christians say? WWJD, what would Jesus do? The later, more peaceful example is the one we're going to strive to imitate. It's the same way in Islam, only in reverse. Their peaceful verses came first when Muhammad was a religious leader in Mecca. They're called weak verses, and they're superseded and erased and abrogated by the later verses that come in Medina. They're called strong verses. So the last example Muhammad left was the political and military example. So in 627 AD, the Meccans send 10,000 soldiers to protect and escort their caravan. Muhammad, with his men, defeats them. Now, how does he do it? Turns out Muhammad is a brilliant military leader because he's creative, he's unpredictable, he's unconventional. He doesn't play by the rules of traditional Arab warfare. So these Arabs had 1 month off a year where they agreed not to fight. It was their pilgrimage Ramadan month. Well, Muhammad gets verses from his Allah instructing him to attack during Ramadan. Sounds familiar? And so he catches them totally off guard. And so when Muhammad is marching toward Medina with 10,000 men, the Meccans are marching toward Medina with 10,000 men. Muhammad's version of roadside bombs was he dug potholes and trenches all around the city of Medina, which rendered the superior cavalry of the Meccans useless. You can't charge your horses and camels across a field full of potholes and trenches. They'll break their legs. Throws off the battle strategy. So Muhammad goes to some of the pagans at night, and he bribes them, and they slip away. He goes to some of the other pagans at night, and he threatens them, and they slip away. Sort of the Chicago politics, the bribe or the bullet, the silver or the lead. Then it gets freezing cold for a week. The rest of the Meccans lose heart and decide to retreat. And it leaves a power vacuum, similar to 2010, when our president declared war in Iraq and Afghanistan was over, mission complete. He pulls all of our troops back home and leaves a power vacuum. Question, did they get really peaceful after that? No, they began what John Kerry described as a genocide. And so when Muhammad saw these Meccans retreating and going back home, he was emboldened that his enemies were cowards and unable to subdue him. He goes back into that city of Medina. And remember those 3 Jewish tribes that were nice and tolerant and let him in 5 years earlier when he was an immigrant refugee? One of the Jewish tribes does something that offends Muhammad. He whips his followers into a jihad frenzy. They attack that Jewish tribe, confiscate their property, chase them out of town. The second Jewish tribe does something that offends Muhammad and his followers. He whips his followers into a jihad frenzy. They do this random outbreak of violence, and they drive the second Jewish tribe out of town. This set a precedent in Islam called hudna, H-U-D-N-A, hudna. It means when you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. So here we are pressuring Israel to make a treaty with the Palestinians when the Palestinian concept of a treaty is just a ceasefire to restock missiles, dig more tunnels. Here we are doing a treaty with Iran when the Iranian concept of a treaty is just to put your enemy off so that you can finish your nuclear missile program. Well, what happened next? Well, we see that Muhammad gets that third Jewish tribe surrounds them in their neighborhood in Medina. And after 25 days, this Jewish tribe surrenders. And Muhammad brings them into the market and chops off their heads. 600 or 700 of the men get their heads chopped off, and then the women and children are sold into slavery. He did keep one of the Jewish wives for himself, Rayhana, ended up having anywhere from 11 to 22 wives. Youngest wife was Aisha, 6 years old. And so within 5 years of Muhammad coming as an immigrant into the Jewish city of Medina, there's not a Jew left in the city of Medina. They were chased out, killed, or enslaved. And within 5 years of Muhammad's death, every pre-existing culture in Arabia is wiped out. And so we see it's a 3-step process. Like Caesar's 3 steps, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Muhammad's 3 steps was immigrate, increase, eliminate. Immigrate into the host country as a religious refugee. increase the number of your followers amongst the disadvantaged minorities, and then demand political accommodation, and then eliminate the previous culture neighborhood by neighborhood until you take over. So I was speaking in Detroit, Michigan, afterwards visiting with people around my book table, and they were telling me about a lady who had a ministry to pregnant moms. She shows up at a Muslim house with a little present. While she's there, out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom. Out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom. Out of a bedroom comes another pregnant Muslim mom, all pregnant by the same man. He's practicing Sharia law polygamy in his house in Dearborn, Michigan. Then someone says, oh, Faisal bought a bunch of houses on the block, put a wife in each one. They go down to the welfare office and say the husband's not around, and they get these checks. He visits the wives, and the more children they have, the larger the checks get. He's living like a king at state expense, and all the kids playing in the middle of the street are his kids. He's practicing Sharia law polygamy on his block in Dearborn, Michigan. Then they take over several more blocks and they vote in the school board. And now they have the girls wearing the burqa and they have the Sharia in the schools and the gymnasiums for their prayer with the boys at the front, the women behind, the girls behind, and then the girls having their period behind them. Muhammad said, if a dog, a donkey, or a woman passes between you and Mecca when you're praying, your prayers are invalidated. So the women have to be in the very back. And so then they take over several more blocks and they vote in the fire department, the police department. And like in Hamtramck, Michigan, they just voted in a majority Muslim city council. And they have their minarets and their loudspeakers on calls to prayer 5 times a day. And all the former Polish inhabitants of the neighborhood are driven out. And so we see it's this 3-step process. They come in as immigrants, and then they increase, and they begin to demand political accommodation, and then they eliminate the previous culture. And so there's a 1,400-year track record to observe this. There's really no mystery as to what's happening. And we break it down into 3 springs. The first is an Arab-Persian spring from 622 to 1071. Second is a Turkish spring from 1071 to 1923. And the third Arab spring started in 1928. Past behavior is the best indicator of future performance. We have 1,400 years of past behavior. They would do something called psychological protection or blame shifting. This is where the attacker blames the victim. Bullies on a playground do this. They push all the other kids around, and then one kid finally has enough, swings back, and the bully beats him up and says, you started it. Teacher, he started it. Wife beaters do this. The big burly husband beats the tar out of the wife. Well, you provoked me. It's your fault. Aggressor nations do this, right? They'll invade some country over some little bitty thing. Well, you provoked us. We're going to go in and invade your country. And so the Muslims would come into a tolerant host community and then accuse that host community of being tolerant of them. It's like, wait a second, you wouldn't be here if we weren't tolerant. But they accuse the other side of what they're guilty of. And then they whip their followers into a frenzy and drive the previous culture out. And so we see that they got a hold of some brand new military technology called the stirrup. It was invented by Mongolian nomads over by China. They would tie a rope around the horse, leave 2 loops hanging for your big toes because you'd ride barefoot, and it would help them keep balance. That invention made its way to China by the 5th century, across the Gobi Desert to Persia, and the Persians made them out of metal with leather straps, and this gave you complete control in the saddle. And then they got these scimitar swords made of Damascus steel, this new process that was very light, like a razor blade. And the Europeans are using these heavy metal swords that take 2 hands. The Muslims hold a scimitar sword in one hand and the reins of the horse in the other. And in a full gallop, they literally could slice somebody in half. You cannot outrun a horse. It was the fastest thing on the battlefield. And the Muslims got this military technology and they took off and they began to conquer. This is the U.S. Supreme Court chamber in Washington, D.C. It has a marble frieze around the ceiling of lawgivers through history. It does have Moses and his 10 Hebrew commandments, but it's got Muhammad with his Arabic Quran and his scimitar sword. And this is Muhammad's sword. It still exists in a palace museum in Istanbul, Turkey. And so we see this lightning expansion of Islam. One of Muhammad's generals was Khalid ibn al-Walid, called the Drawn Sword of Allah because he was undefeated in over 100 battles. And we see that they conquered Syria. Syria was the first country that was completely Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. The name Christian was first used in Syria. There's more ancient Christian writing in the Syrian language of Syriac than any other language other than Greek and Latin. And these Syrian Christians evangelized east like the Greeks did west. So these Syrian Christians evangelized into India, Mongolia, even China during the Tang Dynasty in the 600s had a thriving Syrian Christian community. It's largely wiped out by a Muslim leader named Tamerlane through Central Asia. And then the Muslims conquered Yemen, which used to be a Jewish kingdom. Ghassanids were Arab Christians. Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine, till Caliph Umar conquered it. Caliph Umar conquered Syria, and then the Muslims conquered Egypt under Amir ibn al-As. Egypt was completely Christian, evangelized by Mark, that wrote the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century, all conquered by the Umayyad Muslims, and then they invaded Spain, Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia. All this happened within 23 years of Muhammad's death. It was a heart attack to the Roman economy, right? Because Rome traded across the Mediterranean. Now the North Africa and the Middle East is gone. It would be if China held their ships back for a couple months, all of our Walmart shelves would be empty and we'd have an economic heart attack. That's what happened to Rome. Well, one of the things the Muslims held back was the ships of papyrus. These were reeds that grew along the Nile Delta. They dried out and used for paper. So suddenly there was a paper shortage in Europe. They wrote fewer books, and we call this the Dark Ages. And one of the things the Muslims destroyed, the largest library in the world in Alexandria, Egypt, had stuff that went back to Abraham's day. They asked Caliph Umar what to do with the books. And he said, every book that does not agree with the Quran, destroy. And every book that does agree with the Quran is redundant because we have the Quran. So destroy them all. It took 6 months to burn them all. I was reading this article in Breitbart News earlier this year. It says ISIS militants raided the Central Library in Mosul, Iraq, and to destroy all non-Islamic books. These books promote infidelity and call for disobeying Allah, announced a militant to the residents, so they will be burned. Goes on. The ISIS militants targeted the library at the University of Mosul. They burnt science and cultural textbooks in front of the students. Boston Globe reported a University of Mosul history professor who spoke on condition he not be named because of his fear of the Islamic State said extremists start wrecking the collections of other public libraries. They're doing the same thing today as Caliph Umar did in 642 AD, right? Anyway, so then they invade Spain and they cross the Strait of Gibraltar. Spaniards are still fighting on foot with heavy metal swords. Muslims are on Arabian horses with stirrups and scimitar swords. In 10 years, they conquer all of Spain. They cross the Pyrenees Mountains, conquer southern France. They're finally stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. They go from Arabia to Paris in a military campaign. And since this is Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs, the fundamental Muslims look back to them the way we look back to Jesus and the apostles. We say, well, what's the pure Christian? Let's go back and see, how did they do it in the early church? Let's look at Jesus and the apostles and what example did they leave? And so the fundamental Muslims, they look back to Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs, and they were warriors. And now there are lots of Muslims who have backslidden, and they've developed nonviolent traditions. But every now and then, you get a movement where they want to go back to following Muhammad's example. We call that getting radicalized. So it takes 700 years to drive the Muslims out of Spain. Charlton Heston did a movie, El Cid. I met Charlton Heston. He endorsed me when I ran for Congress years ago. He was the head of the NRA. But here's El Cid. He's driving the Muslims out of this portion of Spain, fighting really courageously, but he's wounded. And he needs one more charge to win, and he knows they can win. He's just this close. And they look at him and say, you're going to die. You're bleeding to death. And he goes, well, I'm going to die anyway, so put me back on the horse, tie me on really tight with a board up my back. Then they slap the horse. They open the barn doors. The horse goes off riding. The men go, there goes El Cid. They hop on their horses. They go off riding, and they win the battle. After the victory, they're all celebrating, and they go, where's El Cid? And they go, oh, he's over there. Sort of drooped over. It's one of those romantic chick flicks, you know. Oh, let's rent El Cid tonight. Oh, and so they're fighting these courageous battles and driving the Muslims out. Well, while they're in Spain, the Muslims enslaved over 1 million people. And anyway, but then they come around the other side of the Mediterranean and they attack Constantinople, which was the capital of the world, right? The Western world. So Rome moved its capital from Rome, Italy to Constantinople, where the Black Sea empties into the Mediterranean. The Muslims attacked it 5 times, but they were turned back because the defenders had the military advantage of Greek fire. It's where they took oil and sawdust, mixed it in these brass containers, sort of like a coagulant, like napalm. And they'd spray it out of these hot oil cannons, sort of like holding a match in front of a can of hairspray. You never tried that, did you? Anyway, so some definitions. The word Islam means submission to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of Allah. And Islam believes there will be world peace when the whole world submits to the will of Allah. So Islam is a religion of peace. It's just their definition of peace is different than ours. Our definition of peace is different groups getting along. Their definition of peace is world Islam. So that's their goal. Their goal is to force everybody in the world to submit to Allah. It's sort of like Lincoln said, April 18th, 1864, we all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. We all want peace, but when we say it, it's not the same as when they say it. So in Islam, the world's divided in two, the half that has submitted to Allah and the half that's in the process of submitting to Allah. The half that has submitted is called the Dar al-Islam, the house of submission. The half that's in the process of submitting to Allah is called the Dar al-Harb, the house of war. The non-Muslim world is supposed to be at war because it's in the process of being submitted. What about moderate Muslims? There are lots of moderate Muslims. The majority of Muslims are moderate Muslims. Moderate Muslims believe the world will submit to Allah later, maybe in the distant future, maybe at the end of the world, maybe it's even figurative. And since it's so far off in the distant future, they just want to live their lives and have their family. Fine. That type of Muslim has no problem living in a free democratic society and having you as a kafir infidel as a neighbor. The fundamental Muslim, they think the world is supposed to submit to Allah now, and they're really excited and they want to help make it happen. Now, the dilemma we face in the West is the more we bend over backwards to show ourselves nice and tolerant and respectful and really careful not to offend them, the moderate Muslim begins to rethink. It says, this has never happened before. Maybe the world is, in fact, submitting to Allah now rather than later. And so they gravitate from the future peaceful mindset into the it's happening now mindset, which is the violent mindset. So all of our efforts to show ourselves really, really nice is actually creating more violence. Sort of like the law of the jungle, lions chasing a zebra, and as long as the zebras are fit and strong and running away, but when a zebra trips, does the lion pause and give him a head start, or does he pounce? Weakness invites aggression. So in Islam, they have a concept. When your enemy shows weakness, that is Allah giving them to you. So our niceness is interpreted as weakness, which causes them to say, okay, now it's time for us to get violent. Now, another word to define is the word innocent. When Muslims do terrorist attacks, politicians are quick to assure us they don't represent true Islam because Islam says it's wrong to kill the innocent. Let's define the word innocent. Innocent is a faithful follower of the way of Allah, the Sunnah, the example that Muhammad left. And so, if you are rejecting the example of Muhammad, if you're rejecting Allah, you're no longer innocent, you're guilty. And so it says, Allah loveth not those who reject the faith. Be ruthless to the infidel, the unbeliever. Make war on the infidel. Fight those who believe not in Allah. Kill the disbeliever wherever we find them. So when they say it's wrong to kill the innocent, it's code for it's wrong to kill faithful Muslims. Now, in all due respect, the non-violent Muslims, they consider them as having left the way of Allah. And so the killer Muslims have no problem killing the nonviolent Muslims as much as they like to kill the infidels. So they enslaved over 1 million Europeans and had entire Catholic orders in Europe through the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians. The head of the order was called the ransomer, and they would collect alms and donations and go under a white flag to rescue back your friend who was captured by the Muslims or made a sex slave or something. And Muhammad raided caravans, and so they had ships the Muslims would raid on the Mediterranean. And they would raid the coast of Italy, Spain, France, Greek islands. And so they actually raided Ireland. In 1635, the Muslims come up and attack the city of Baltimore, Ireland, kill a bunch, round up the whole rest of the town, put them on ships, take them to Morocco, sell them into slavery. Then they attack Iceland, and they carry away 400 from Reykjavik, Iceland, take them to... One of the pilgrim ships was captured by the Muslims. In 1625, the pilgrims saved up 800 pounds of beaver skin, sent it back to Europe. Muslims captured it, took the crew to Morocco, sold them into slavery. And so there were whole coasts of Italy where there was not a woman of childbearing age for generations because the Muslim ISIS, attackers would come up and they would round up the women and put them on their ships and take them to Morocco, sell them into slavery. In 846 AD, they attacked Rome, and they destroyed the Basilica of St. Peter's and trashed the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul. It was after that Pope Leo decided to build the wall around the Vatican. See, the Vatican was... So Circus Maximus, Peter's crucified upside down. Rome becomes Christian. They take it and turn that into the Basilica of St. Peter's as church. Over the centuries, it began to tilt over so much, like 4 feet from top to bottom. And then finally, they took it down and they built the big Vatican there. But when it was still the Basilica of St. Peter's is when the Muslims attacked, trashed the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul. And it was after that that Pope Leo decided to build the wall around it. So here we have the Pope building a wall to keep the Muslim immigrants out. Okay, you'll catch that later. Then the Muslims enslaved estimated 180 million Africans. And they would castrate the men, make them eunuchs, sell the women into the sex trafficking. Muhammad was a white Arab and he owned African slaves. In Arabic, there's one word for African and slave. It's abd, A-B-D. Like Abdullah means slave of Allah. And so every African they call a slave. And it would go on for centuries. For 8 centuries before America was ever discovered, the Muslims are enslaving Africans. And then after America was discovered, the Spaniards enslaved Native Americans for a generation, and then a Catholic priest, same time Martin Luther's doing the Reformation, Bartolomé de las Casas, this Catholic priest, finally pressures the King of Spain to outlaw the enslavement of Native Americans. When he agrees to it, the greedy guys say, well, where can we get more slaves? Someone said, Africa. That's when they began to buy them from Africa. But every African brought to America was purchased at a Muslim slave market. And unfortunately, it continued. And so Scottish missionary to the Congo, David Livingstone, he writes in his journal about stumbling across a line of Africans shackled together, being marched to the coast to be sold into Muslim slavery. And if they marched too slow, the Muslim slave trade would kill them. He said you could tell where the trails were by looking for the vultures circling. And then it still goes on today. There's actually more slavery today than at any other time in world history, and a lot of it is in Muslim countries, Niger, Mauritania, Sudan. Well, people say, well, Bill, you just talked about Muslims killing people. Didn't Christians kill people too? What about the Crusades, huh? Let's talk about that. That's the second spring, the Turks. And so went from 1071 to 1923. And so before we get into comparing the followers, saying Muslims kill people, Christians kill people, every religion has crazies that kill people, let's not compare the followers, let's compare the founders. If your computer acts up, what do? You reload the software the way it was when you bought it. If your religion acts up, what do? You go back to the way it was when it left the founder. So let's compare founders. The largest religion in the world is Christianity, about 33%. Second largest religion in the world is Islam, about 23%, followed by 16% unaffiliated, 15% Hindu, 7% Buddhist, down to 0.2% Jewish. So let's compare the founders of the 2 largest religions in the world. Jesus never killed anyone. Muhammad killed an estimated 3,000 people, including cutting off the heads of those 700 Jews. Jesus never led armies. Muhammad led armies. Jesus never owned slaves. Muhammad owned slaves. Jesus never married. Muhammad had 11 to 22 wives, slave wives, concubines. Jesus never tortured anyone. When Muhammad conquered Khaybar, the last Jewish settlement in Arabia, the chief refused to tell where the tribe's treasure was hidden in the desert. Muhammad had him stretched out on the ground and they kindled a fire on his chest. He still wouldn't tell. Muhammad had him beheaded. Jesus didn't lie. He said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Muhammad permitted lying. It's called taqiyya, sacred lying, holy deceit. There was a chieftain planning on attacking Muhammad. Muhammad goes to his warriors, said, who will rid me of this chieftain? His one warrior said, I will if you permit me to lie. Muhammad said, go. So he goes to the chieftain and said, I've left Muhammad. He's a heretic. I want to help you, but they're after me. The chieftain says, you can spend the night in my tent. You'll have my whole army surrounding and protecting you. You'll be safe. In the middle of the night, the warrior tiptoes over and beheads the chieftain, runs with the head all the way, gives it to Muhammad, and says, oh, prophet, Allah's face is shown upon you. And Muhammad said, Allah's face is shown upon you. Muhammad gives him his staff and says, you can lean on this in the day of judgment, because on that day, many people won't have anything to lean upon. Muhammad approved of lying to your infidel enemy so that you can gain the advantage and behead them. Another story, there was one of Muhammad's warriors captured, and he was forced to renounce Muhammad. He escaped, went back to Muhammad. Muhammad forgave him and said, if they make you turn, turn, but don't turn in your heart. In other words, it's okay to deny Muhammad in a pinch to save your skin, as long as you don't fight against Islam. In other words, it's okay to say you're not a Muslim in order to get elected, but then everything you do once you're elected is to help advance Islam. Jesus never forced anyone to follow him. He said something difficult. Many disciples walked with him no more. Turns to Peter and says, you want to go too? Peter said, where else can I go? You're the only one with the words of eternal life. He was willing to let him go. Muhammad said, whoever changes his Islamic religion, kill him. So it's like Hotel California. You're free to come in, just can't leave. Now, this is an Egyptian imam, Yusuf Qaradar. He is a present-day imam, and he says if they had gotten rid of the apostasy punishment, that means killing you if you leave Islam, Islam wouldn't exist today. Islam would have ended since the death of the prophet. Muhammad died, a bunch of Muslims wanted to leave, and the Caliph Abu Bakr, the father of the six-year-old that he married, he says he can't leave, and he kills thousands of them in the Ridda Wars, the apostasy wars. Anyway, and so Jesus forgave insults, died on the cross saying, Father, forgive him. Muhammad avenged insults. A guy named Ibn Khattal made up poems about Muhammad and his slave girls reciting them, and Muhammad ordered them murdered. So the idea of if you insult the prophet, you get killed goes all the way back to the prophet himself. Jesus did not permit his disciples to rape anyone. Duh, Muhammad did. There's always hadiths that talk about how to do it. None of the apostles were governors or generals. Every one of the caliphs and sultans was a governor and a general. Jesus taught God was our Father. In Islam, it's blasphemy to call Allah your Father. Jesus taught we're children of God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to call yourself a child of Allah, because Allah took no wife and has no son. Jesus taught we're made in the image of God. In Islam, Allah has no image. Jesus taught to have a personal relationship with God. In Islam, it's blasphemy to even want to have a personal relationship with Allah because he's transcendent and unknowable. The first 3 centuries of Christianity, there are 10 major persecutions. Christians are thrown to the lions. They never led an armed resistance against the Roman emperor. The first 3 centuries of Islam, they conquered from Arabia to Paris. People say, well, we're all worshiping the same God. Well, let's think. Christianity, the largest religion in the world, says you believe in Jesus, that he's the Lamb of God, died on the cross to pay for your sins, you go to heaven. Islam has an unforgivable sin called shirk, S-H-I-R-K, shirk. And they say that if you believe that Jesus is the Christ, you have committed the unforgivable sin called shirk that condemns you to hell. So question, if we are all worshiping the same God, how can the same God say, if you believe in Jesus, you go up, and if you believe in Jesus, you go down? Either God is schizophrenic or we're talking about 2 different gods. Well, the Crusades. So Muslims had 14 centuries of crusades, killed 240 million people, and they're still going on today. The Europeans only had 2 centuries of crusades. And so more people have been killed by Muslim crusades, their jihad, than all of the combined Mao Zedong killed 80 million people, Stalin 20 million, Hitler 6 million, so forth. And so as these Muslims, crusaders, are invading into what is today Turkey, back then it was the Byzantine Christian Empire. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by the Muslim Turks. And so through the story of St. Nicholas, the most popular Greek saint was St. Nicholas, lived during Roman times, gave to the poor. And when the Muslims were coming into Greece, they were going to destroy his grave. And so the Christians took the grave of St. Nicholas, moved it over to Italy in the year 1087. The pope that dedicates the church is Pope Urban II. He's the same pope that goes to the Council of Clermont, begs these European leaders to send help. They send help. It's called the Crusades. Right? And now in Holland, they still have the story that St. Nicholas comes once a year riding a white horse, and he has with him a helper named Zwarte Piet, who's a Muslim. And they tell the little kids that if you're good, St. Nicholas will give you a present. If you're naughty, his little Muslim helper will put you in a gunny sack, take you back to Spain, and sell you into Muslim slavery. I have 11 brothers and sisters. I would have loved to have tormented my little brothers. We might not see you. We'll see a little kid in a gunny sack there. Please don't take me. It's like, sorry, you should have been a good kid, you know. But I share this because this was the fear across Europe. Muslims coming and kidnapping people, because they kidnapped and sold over 1 million into slavery. And anyway, here's the St. Charles Bridge in Prague, Czechoslovakia. And so you see the Muslim with a sword, and in the cage is a captive, and above are these Catholic orders that would ransom back the slaves. And so here's Pope Urban II. He goes to the Council of Clermont and begs for help, and they send help. It's called the Crusades. I'm running out of time here. So Richard the Lionheart leads the 3rd Crusade. St. Louis leads the 7th and 8th Crusades. The Crusades end. Muslims still control all this huge area. Then a Muslim leader named Tamerlane kills 17 million people across Central Asia. Anyway, Then the Muslims invade into Eastern Europe. By 1450, they cross the Bosporus, conquer Constantinople. This cuts off the land routes to India and China, and that's when Columbus set sail looking for a sea route to India and China. Columbus would never have set sail over here if it had not been for a jihad over there. And people forget Marco Polo in 1271 went to China, brought back spaghetti noodles, gunpowder, charcoal, and so when the Muslims cut off the trade routes, that's when the Europeans looked for a sea route, and so Columbus said, hey, let's go to India and China by sea, and he's convinced he's in India, so he names the inhabitants the Indians. Think of it, we never would have called Native Americans Indians if it had not been for Islamic jihad. Columbus gave him the name Indians because he thought he was in India. Why was Columbus trying to get to India in 1492? Because in 1453, the Muslims conquered Constantinople, cutting off the land routes to India. Anyway, as the Muslims are invading into Greece, they're destroying churches and art and literature. So the Greeks flee to Florence, Italy with all their Greek stuff, and we call this the Renaissance. Then the Muslims, the Christians flee with their Greek New Testaments, and this causes the Europeans to translate the Bible not just to Latin but to Greek, and this lays the foundation for the Reformation. And so in 1517, Martin Luther starts the Reformation. In 1529, 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna under Suleiman the Magnificent. Martin Luther says, the Turk is the rod of the wrath of the Lord our God. If the Turk God the devil is not beaten from first, there is reason to fear the Turk will not be so easy to beat. Lots of more quotes, but for the sake of time, Sultan Suleiman controls this huge area. Charles V, Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, controls this area. Charles V decides to strike a deal with the Protestants called the Peace of Augsburg. And this says, look, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against these Muslims who are invading Europe. Anyway, so in 1565, Muslims control almost the entire Mediterranean, but they need the little island of Malta, and they have 40,000 Muslims bombard this little island. There's only 1,000 defenders, the Knights of Malta. They courageously drive the Muslims back on September 11th, 1565. And then in 1683, 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna, and they're driven back on September 11th, 1683, by the Polish king Jan Sobieski. He has the largest cavalry charge in history up to that date, 40,000 big Polish hussar horses. The soldiers had made wings for their back, which made this enormous flapping noise. When Jan Sobieski was considered the savior of Western civilization, and after the battle, he goes into these abandoned Muslim tents and finds these bags of beans, coffee beans, realizes this is this new drink that the Muslims could drink that allowed them to fight day and night. And shortly thereafter, this Polish general, George Franz Kloszowski, opens the first Vienna coffee house. Now, the word coffee comes from the Arabic word kafir, which means infidel. Because the beans came from Ethiopia, which was one of the few countries that was able to stay Christian. So the Muslims called the Christians in Ethiopia kafirs or infidels. And since the bean came from there, they called it the kafir bean, or as we say, the coffee bean. So have you had your cup of infidel today? But now, I show a picture. When the Muslims were surrounding Vienna, they were tunneling under the walls. The baker was up early baking bread, heard the noise. They told the soldiers, put out buckets of water. They see the ripples. They find out where the tunnel is, and they get in there, find it filled full of gunpowder. They were about to blow up and have the wall fall down. They defuse it. After the victory, they're going to reward the baker. He says, I don't need a reward. Just give me the sole permission to cook a pastry in the shape of the Muslim crescent, and it was called croissant, the crescent roll. So the next time you have coffee and croissants, you can celebrate the victory of the Battle of Vienna, September 11, 1683. From this point on, the Ottoman Empire began to fall down, and Captain John Smith spent 5 years fighting the Muslims in Hungary before he founded Jamestown, Virginia. And anyway, Napoleon invades Egypt in 1798. He's going to try to introduce liberty, equality. There's no words in the Arabic language for liberty and equality, and he finally has to leave. And then we have the Muslims attacking our ships, and we call this the Barbary Pirate Wars. And Thomas Jefferson gets fed up, sends in our Navy and the Marines. We were paying 20% of our federal budget to these Muslim pirates. And Jefferson said enough, and that's where we get the Marine anthem from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Anyway, I'm going to skip past this. My clock is just going so fast. And so after World War I, the Ottoman Empire is gone. Britain ruled the world for 2 centuries. And America wins World War I, World War II. So the Muslim world decided, hey, the West is the future. So they would get these secular kings that would distance themselves from their bloody fundamentalist past, and these Muslim kings and presidents would dress in business suits, send their kids to Western schools, teach English in their countries. It was moving in a westerly direction like the Shah of Iran. He loved America. I met his son. And so it was moving in this direction until 1928, the Muslim Brotherhood was started, and that's the third Arab Spring. And they would infiltrate into countries. Now, Armenia wanted to break away from the Ottoman Empire, and we didn't do anything, and they killed 1.5 million Armenians between 1915 and 1922. And then they get a new secular leader in Turkey named Ataturk. And he decides, let's separate from our fundamentalist past. Let's dress in business suits. Let's get rid of the Muslim beards and the burqas and the Arabic language. And he tries to secularize Turkey. He puts the military in charge of making sure Turkey stays secular. It worked until this current guy got elected, Erdogan. And he's trying to make the Turkey into the fundamentalist Muslim country again. His goal, reestablish the caliphate, reestablish the Ottoman Empire, call it an ISIS, Islamic State, and have one Muslim leader called the Caliph. And so this is the Arab Spring in 1928. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood has based their strategy on the two cities Muhammad lived in. Remember those two cities? Mecca, Muhammad was a religious leader. Medina, he's a political military leader. So the Muslim Brotherhood would say, look, lots of Muslims are nonviolent. Pretend like you're a Meccan Muslim, a nonviolent Muslim, like Muhammad was when he was in Mecca, to infiltrate into the country. And then when you get into enough positions of authority and power, you spring the trap and you become a political militant Muslim and overthrow the government. And this is what happened throughout all these countries in the Middle East, and we call them Arab Springs. And our government in America decided to back the Arab Spring and pulling the rugs out from all these presidents. So Obama got rid of Mubarak in Egypt. He takes out Gaddafi in Libya. I'm still trying to figure out how this works. Our president decides to knock off the leader of a country that we're not at war with. Oh, well, that's to bring in democracy. Okay, 2 years ago, who now controls Libya? The Muslim Brotherhood. And now we're finding out. So 1938, the Muslim Brotherhood got a shot in the arm with the Standard Oil Company discovering oil in Saudi Arabia. And in one generation, Saudi Arabia goes from the poorest Muslim country to the richest Muslim country. And what are they doing? Saudi Arabia is one of the main funders of spreading fundamentalist Sharia law Islam. And also, Saudi Arabia got so rich, so fast, the rest of the Muslim world said, why try to be like the West to be blessed? Let's be more fundamentalist Muslim. We threw the electric magnet switch, and all the Muslims started gravitating, becoming more fundamentalist. And anyway, Hitler was going to send all the Jews to Palestine to get rid of them. And the Mufti of Jerusalem said, we don't want them, kill them. And then 1971, Muslims killed 2.5 million Hindus, and Nixon and Kissinger do nothing. 1983, Muslims blew up our Marine barracks, killed 241 U.S. Marines. I love Reagan, but he just decided to withdraw. And then Sharia is trying to be like Muhammad. Like Christians want to be like Jesus, Muslims want to be like Muhammad. Now, important distinction. Christians want to be like Jesus, but Christians do not believe they go to heaven by being like Jesus. Christians go to heaven because Jesus died on the cross to pay for their sins. They want to be like Jesus to show the rest of the world how much God loves them, but they don't think they're earning their salvation. Not so in Islam. Islam believes that the closer they can imitate Muhammad, the better chance they have of going to paradise. And so what Muhammad permitted is permitted. That's called halal. What he did not permit is called haram. So Muhammad liked cats. Cats are halal. They are permitted. Muhammad did not like dogs. Dogs are haram. They are not permitted. So Sharia law is a long list of halals and harams. A long list of what's permitted, what's not permitted. The local imam keeps the list. It's not a personal conscience religion. It's keeping this outward compliance list. And anyway, so we see how do moderate Muslims who believe the world's going to submit to Allah in the future, how do they turn into political militant Muslims that believe the world's going to submit now? Well, Bush was the first president to speak in a mosque. Take off his shoes. Why did he do that? For votes. You want senior votes, go to senior center. Want union votes, go to union hall. Want Muslim votes, go to a mosque. He doesn't realize they got their own agenda. He's the first president to celebrate Ramadan in the White House, put a Quran in the presidential library. His wife puts on the Muslim veil. Nancy Pelosi puts on the Muslim veil. Hillary Clinton puts on the Muslim veil and whatever. And then we have Muslims having prayer on the U.S. Capitol lawn. What would we think if Billy Graham had a crusade in downtown, Riyadh? And we have Muslims in the Democrat Party and now beginning to come into here's Denver, Colorado Public High School, has the kids, Fort Collins, Colorado, has the kids say the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under Allah. And now we're seeing they're buying the textbook companies, and they have chapters on Islam. And this Muslim billionaire named Gulen has figured out how to set up Muslim charter schools at state taxpayer expense. And now they're Islamifying our schools, taking the kids on field trips to mosque, having them practice learning Muslim prayers and Muslim names. Oh, it's all cultural. It's a proselytizing. And we issue Muslim postage stamps. And I threw this picture in there. You got to look at it for a second. Smile. Anyway. We have Muslims swearing in upon a Quran. Why is that a problem? The Quran says it came straight from Allah, so it's superior to man-made laws, and it's okay to lie to make it superior. And the head of NASA says that the president wants him to reach out to the Muslim world. And then we have Muslim imams come into the White House so often they don't get carded. This is a rich Muslim, Saudi Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. He's one of the richest men in the world, donates money to suicide bombers' care, starts schools of Islamic study at Harvard, Georgetown, and in 2005, he bought an interest in Fox News. And from that point on, Fox News began to treat Islam with kid gloves. And what would Fox News do? It would interview CARE and lift them up and make them the Islamic spokesperson. Instead of lifting up Zuhdi Jasser or some of the other ones that say, wait a second, we don't want all that violent stuff. And so here's our president who's bowing to the king of Saudi Arabia and saying whatever we once were, we're no longer a Christian nation. And the president campaigned for Odinga, who promised to bring Sharia law into Kenya. Our president has earmarked millions of dollars to go over and help them to organize the Muslim overthrow of the government there. And then these are Muslims that have connections with the Muslim Brotherhood in our U.S. government right now. And so Arif Ali Khan was the deputy mayor of Los Angeles. He stopped Los Angeles from tracking terrorists, did such a good job, he's chosen to be a key member of Homeland Security. Kareem Shor is the devout Muslim from Damascus. He's a member of Homeland Security. Rashad Hussain is Deputy Associate White House Consul. He has the whole Quran memorized. He says the president is educator-in-chief to America on Islam. Dahlia Magahed is the first veiled Muslim woman appointed by the president. She said Sharia law is gender justice. And Jay Johnson, the head of Homeland Security, he said, my job is to give voice to the plight of Muslims. So when the Muslims killed people in Orlando recently, his response was, we need to make sure that we no longer use the term Sharia or Islam or jihad in the Department of Homeland Security. Oh, yeah, and we want to watch out for right-wing terrorists. And we want to start saying that taking away guns is part of Homeland Security's responsibility. It's like, wait a second. The very people that did so we see this as a psychological projection, right? So you want to accuse the other people of what they're guilty of. The president's senior advisor, Valerie Jarrett, was born in Iran and rumored to be a Muslim. And then they're infiltrating conservative groups. Here's a guy, Suhail Khan, whose parents helped found the Muslim Brotherhood chapters and Muslim student associations in California. And so they're infiltrated into all these different groups. Hillary Clinton's right-hand person, Huma Abedin, we found out with her help, Hillary rebuilt mosques in 27 countries. She was doing that as Secretary of State, using U.S. taxpayer money to rebuild mosques. Then we find out that Hillary's been getting hundreds of millions of dollars as Secretary of State to her foundation. And she meets with the richest men in the world. It's called the OIC. It's a UN inside the UN. And these are the 57 Muslim country leaders. They're very wealthy. And what was their big deal? They want to stop people from insulting Islam. It's called the Istanbul Process. UN Resolution 1618. Hillary promises to help them push their goal of to stop people from insulting Islam. Now, just some definition. The gospel insults Islam. If you were to go to the street corner of Saudi Arabia and say, Jesus is the way to heaven, they'd kill you. Saying Jerusalem's the capital of Israel insults Islam. Matter of fact, everything that's not Islam insults Islam. You look at the 1,400 years of Islam, wherever they conquer, the people they conquer are forbidden to insult them. So when she says, I'm going to help you to make sure people don't insult Islam, I want to help you at Sharia law globally. And so shortly after that, she pulls the defense out of Benghazi. The ambassador gets killed. Within 6 hours, she says, it's these people insulting Islam. We got to stop people from insulting Islam. And it starts to go until they look and they say, wait a second, this guy's been asking for help and you've been denying it. And so now we're finding out most of Hillary's emails that she doesn't want people to see on her server are inventory lists of weapons that were used to get rid of Gaddafi in Libya, and they were moving these weapons to arm the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria to get rid of Assad. When Russia comes to Assad's rescue, these Muslim Brotherhood people, armed by America, trained by America, they call themselves ISIS and kill the Christians. ISIS is using American weapons, driving American Humvees. And now the president let 5 Muslim generals go from Guantanamo Bay in exchange for a defector. And then we find Susan Rice was micromanaging our airstrikes, giving them a week's notice so they could get out. So we were bombing empty buildings. And so we see that Turkey is supposed to be our ally. And these Christians that are being killed are coming up to the borders of Turkey saying, let us in, we're being killed. And Turkey says no. And anyway, and then when it finally comes out that it had nothing to do with the videos, Hillary says, oh, it was a long time ago. And now the Fox News, Hillary Clinton approved arms sales for terrorist enemies of the United States. Exclusive docs, Fox News, shows weapons going from Benghazi to Syria. And we pulled out and left all of our military weapons there on our bases. Declassified docs. Obama ordered CIA to train ISIS. Hillary aided their eyes of ISIS. We're still selling billions of dollars to terrorist organizations and Hamas. And so this is cities that our young men and women fought to free from Saddam Hussein. Now they're being taken over by ISIS. And their goal is they want it all back. And this little red spot is Israel. Does anybody honestly think if we abandon Israel that suddenly they'll all get nice? On the contrary, if Israel falls, which it won't, but if Israel did, every Muslim in the world would think it's really happening now, not in the future, and every one of them will come into the it's happening now mindset. And now we see that they're coming into South America. You see the populations of Guyana, Trinidad, Suriname, Tobago, now 25% Muslim in these countries. And then Hugo Chavez had been bringing Muslim terrorists over from Iran to Venezuela, teaching them Spanish, sending them north. So they've infiltrated the drug gangs, and they got lots of Saudi money, and they're buying access into these drug gangs to smuggle them across, and they're being spread out to cities all across America. And now we're seeing, here's Mexican ISIS drug cartels are talking to each other. Former Homeland Security, ISIS may have crossed the southern border. Training camps along Muslims' border. Marriage made in hell. Ellen West talks about ISIS and Mexican cartels teaming up. These are the children, MS-13 gang member children that the president has been bringing across the border. And so we see, here's a Ferguson sign. I used to live a half an hour from Ferguson. 99% of the people riding in Ferguson were not from Ferguson. They were all brought in. They actually advertised in Chicago papers, the Organized Majority for Justice. It was a George Soros front group. They bring him in. Poor people don't get the idea of holding hands across an interstate highway. Somebody's training them how to do this. And so the thought is, all these Muslim immigrants that the president's bringing into America with no background checks being done, bringing them by the thousands into these rural cities, putting them into their Section 8 housing so these rural communities have to pay the taxes to support them. And there's more reports coming out of mosques being armed and secret basements and secret closets, right? They've been raiding mosques in France and Germany after these riots. They find them all with these weapons. And the thought is, are we being set up for an Arab Spring? Simultaneous Baltimores, Fergusons, Orlandos, San Bernardinos may be building up to a head before the next election. And in the crisis, somebody's going to say the president needs to declare martial law. The president needs to have Jay Johnson and Homeland Security take away all these weapons, and we need to go house to house. And then some people are going to say, no, we're not going to let them. And he's going, oh, it's the law. And then they'll come in and they've been chasing all the Christians out of the military, right? The homosexual agenda has been very instrumental in pushing all the old valued people out. And now they're bringing in the Muslims into the military. And so this is a situation. You look at Europe, went from a Judeo-Christian past into a secular, free-sex, gay-neutral, but now Europe's going into an Islamic future. And so the gay agenda is a transition phase from the Christian, Judeo-Christian past till the Muslim future. And so now we have the very people that 10 years ago we were warning about. Now they're the ones in the military doing training, making converts, making sure our women have to submit to Sharia law and put on the veils. And here we have transition from a Judeo-Christian military into now embracing the homosexual agenda, and now Islam's making inroads into our military. And so it's an unholy alliance. Here's a David Horowitz quote. The unholy alliance between the left and radical Islam presents the greatest threat the United States has faced in our lifetime. I thought this was interesting. This is a West African cardinal, and he spoke just this last year in Washington, D.C. He says, two apocalyptic beasts, the two major threats, the LGBT LGBT lobby and ISIS, the same demonic origin of these two. You cannot join Christ and Belial. And anyway, so they got Sharia for America. 10 years ago, there were 3 mosques in Germany. Today, there's over 200. France has let in over 5 million Muslims. They have 751 neighborhoods surrounding Paris. The best the police can do is put up a sign that says, enter at your own risk. Because if you go in there and you're raped, there's no witnesses, because no Muslim will testify against another Muslim on behalf of an infidel. They're taking over Britain. We got their new London mayor that's a Muslim. And these cities, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, you know, the Beatles, right? All that's Muslim now. And the number 1 name for newborns in London is Mohammed. Same for Brussels. And the largest mosque in Europe is in Italy. And Netherlands has 40 no-go zones where you can't go in there because they're Muslim neighborhoods. And Sweden, now the number 1 crime in Sweden is rape. Muslim immigrants raping European women. Like, because Muhammad permitted the men to rape the women they took in battle. And so it's a brilliant strategy. You take advantage of the diversity, multiculturalism, freedom of religion to immigrate in, but once you're in, you begin to organize and take over politically and then begin the military violence and take over the neighborhoods. So there's the religion of Islam, but then there's this political military aspect of Islam. So is Islam just a religion? A way to describe this is the word light. What does the word light mean? Well, in grammar, it's a noun, it's a source of illumination, it's a thing. Light is also an adjective, like light as a feather, and light is a verb, like you're going to light a fire. So light, spelled L-I-G-H-T, is one word with 3 meanings. It's a noun, an adjective, and a verb. Islam is one word with 3 meanings. It's a religious system, a political system, and a military system. Using the grammar analogy, the fundamental Muslims want us to treat them like a noun, yet they want the freedom to act like an adjective and a verb. And so we see that, here's Winston Churchill, individual Muslims may show splendid qualities, but the influence of the religion paralyzes social development. And so in closing, there's political military Islam. Let's look at it for a second and compare it to past political military systems. In the last 70 years, what political military systems has the world had to face that had a global conquest aspect to them, and wherever they took over, non-adherents were not equal? Well, let's see. I'm half German, but in the 1930s, America said, look, we love Germans, but we have to stand against this political military system of Nazism. Why? It has a global conquest aspect to it, and wherever it takes over, non-Nazis like Jews are not equal. And we love the Italian, but we had to stand against Mussolini's fascism. And we love the Japanese, but we had to stand against Emperor Hirohito's imperialism. And we love the Russian, but we had to stand against Stalin's, communism, because it has a global conquest aspect, and wherever it took over, non-adherents were not equal. We love the Chinese, but we had to stand against Mao's collectivism. And today we love the Arab, the Turk, the Indonesian, the Pakistani, the Egyptian, but we have to stand against political military Islam. Why? It has a global conquest aspect to it. Wherever it takes over, non-Muslims are not treated with equality. And so, ever see this bumper sticker? For this to work, each group would have to teach itself to be nice to those that are not in the group. You know, my son was little, we got him a goldfish and got him some more goldfish, and then he wanted this little feathery fish. We put it in the bowl. It starts taking nips out of the other fish's fins, and within a week, all the other fishes are dead, floating on top of the water. There's only one fish left. Why couldn't they all coexist in that bowl? This fella had it in his DNA to be aggressive. What's the DNA of these different religions? Their teachings. Jesus said, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you. Muhammad said, infidels are your sworn enemies, be ruthless to the infidels, make war on the infidels. There's no verse in all of Islam that says, do unto the infidel the way you want the infidel to do unto you. And now I have to remind myself that Christianity was born into a one-world anti-Christian government, the Roman Empire. And so evidently the God of the universe and the created us, he's not afraid of one-world anti-Christian governments because he had the church born into it. And the church ended up overcoming it. And so also Christianity is still the fastest growing religion in the world. Over 80,000 added every day, mostly in Africa, the Middle East, India, and Asia. And Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the world, with over 500 martyred every day, mostly in Africa, the Middle East, India, and Asia. So where the persecution is the greatest is where the revival is the greatest. Christianity is dying in Europe, and it's barely holding its own here in America. Now, we have to remind ourselves that, again, not all Muslims are the political militant kind. Egypt threw out the Muslim Brotherhood. They had the largest demonstration in world history. 26 million people gathered together and threw out the Muslim Brotherhood. And so they blame our president for bringing in the Muslim Brotherhood. And so there still is a movement. Now, this is a Coptic Egyptian Christian minister named Father Zachariah Boutros. He broadcasts in Arabic via satellite into the Middle East. Over 6 million Muslims convert to Christianity every year. He's so effective, they have a $6 million fatwa out on him to kill him. But they can't find him because he does it via satellite. This is another ministry, ChristForAllPeoples.org. They give out these DVDs. That's the life of Jesus. Remember the movie the Campus Crusade did, translated in all these languages? This DVD has the majority Muslim languages. Nothing about Islam. And the ladies, you carry around your purse, you're in a mall, you see a lady with a burqa, say, hey, I like to give these out as little presents. Here's one. One of the languages yours? Yeah, Somali, so that's mine. And they see Jesus forgiving the adulterous woman, and they're taught that they're supposed to have the adulterous woman stoned to death, and they come away thinking, I like Jesus. I want to know more about Jesus. And millions of Muslims have become Christians through this. Another is a Muslim from Iraq, came to America, became a Christian, went to Bible school, started ministry, livingoasis.org. And he teaches people how to minister to get Muslims saved. And another is crescentproject.org, Fuad Masri, and he teaches Christians how to witness to Muslims. And that's my website, AmericanMinute.com.